very destructive fish coming in and destroying our perch, our walleye, our native fish. It is a very, very worrisome invasive species to our lakes. Did the gentleman wish to make further comment?
If the gentlelady would yield. I want to thank you very much for your comments. Also, Ms. McCollum also was very aware of this. I think all of us that represent the Great Lakes area understand the danger that this fish is bringing into our Great Lakes, into the fishing industry. It is unbelievable the amount of damage that's being done. Now, not only to the fishing industry, but also boaters. Anybody that has seen film, this is a fish that actually comes out of the water and goes after boaters. It gets very easily aggravated. Now, you don't have to have a motor on the boat. You can be paddling the boat. This fish will come out of the water and hit people. I have 7 grandchildren who I take out with me from time to time. The oldest one is 8 years old. These are small people. This fish is 70 pounds when it reaches its full maturity. It is a voracious eater. It is going to totally take over the Great Lakes. It will ruin our fishing industry. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate your comments and your concern. And also, I know on both sides, this is not a Republican or a Democrat issue. This is an American issue that has to be looked into. And I thank you very much for your comments.
Reclaiming my time and desire to work with the gentleman in any way possible. Literally, the gentleman is right. This fish is like a guided missile, except there are millions of them. And until you actually see it happen, you don't believe it. It's like some kind of movie, The Twilight Zone, except it's real. And it came from the fishing, the aquaculture industry down in Mississippi, which had an accident, and they brought these fish in to do the cleaning in the fish tanks, except that when the walls were breached, they started swimming north in the Mississippi River, and now they're about 30 miles from the Chicago harbor and through the ship canal there. They're about 30 miles from there, but they're coming up into the St. Joseph River in Indiana. They've caught some there. We don't know about the Ohio River, but the Maumee River, which I represent, the largest river that flows into the Great Lakes, which is a spawning area for walleye, for example, this species is really a predator, and one that could wipe out our entire multi-billion-dollar fishing industry in the Great Lakes. And there is no scientific solution at this point. There is no scientific solution. So I hope the administration is hearing us. I hope the Army Corps and Department of Interior and others are hearing us. Our country needs a real solution to prevent the spread of this predator into our freshwater lakes, and it is an unsolved challenge for the nation. So I thank the gentleman so much for coming to the floor today. You have my full support, and I know the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Frelinghuysen, will work with us in any way possible.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Clerk will read.
Page 10, line 22, Section 106. The Secretary may transfer funds to mitigate for fisheries loss due to Corps of Engineers projects. Section 107. None of the funds may be used by the Corps of Engineers to develop or enforce.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Madam Chairwoman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in the congressional record, offered by Mr. Moran of Virginia.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Boy, I just want to say I can relate to Asian carp, and I certainly agree it's a very troubling situation. In fact, we've got these snakeheads in this part of the country that can walk on dry land from river to river and pond to pond. So something's happening, and it's not good. But I'm glad that the issue was raised. But, Madam Chairwoman, I do have an amendment with our colleague John Dingell. The amendment simply strikes Section 107 of this bill. And the reason for doing that is that Section 107 would prevent the Corps of Engineers from updating regulations and guidance defining what waters and wetlands are subject to the Clean Water Act. Even though everyone, including industry, agrees there's confusion regarding what waters fall under federal jurisdiction, Section 107 would deliberately continue this confusion. In fact, many private commercial interests have gone on record in support of clarifying the term waters of the United States. But that clarification would be prohibited under Section 107 of this bill. Madam Chairwoman, there have been 2 Supreme Court cases on this subject. Solid Waste Agency of North Cook County in 2001, and Rapanos in 2006. Combined, these two rulings have created confusion and uncertainty regarding the limits of the federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act. In layman's terms, the court called into question the federal government's jurisdiction the further away the water was from where you could float a boat all year long. In both cases, though, a majority of the court could not agree on where federal jurisdiction should end. Are intermittent streams and rivers that only flow seasonally, are they under federal jurisdiction? 60% of all stream miles in the lower 48 states fall into the category of intermittent or ephemeral. In other words, they don't exist for some part of the year. Yet they receive 40% of all individual wastewater discharges. Even more importantly, more than 117 million Americans get some of their drinking water from these very streams that don't flow year-round. Section 107 of this bill, though, would ensure that these sources of drinking water remain at increased risk of pollution. And with rising temperatures, more severe droughts, and climate change, the protection of our waters and wetlands are a greater concern than ever. And that's why I mentioned the Asian carp, the snakeheads. Severe things are happening, but the most important thing that's happening is that climate change is creating a very extreme threat to every American, and we're seeing it in bodies of water across the country. Before my colleagues suggest we shouldn't worry about climate change, that the states have authority in the absence of federal authority, I should tell my friends that argument doesn't hold, well, let me use the expression, it doesn't hold water in states that use the federal definition to run their program. 48 states share common water bodies. Without federal jurisdiction, no state can tell an upstream state what to do unless we have a baseline minimum federal standard that all states must abide by. Now, through a public comment process and appropriate congressional oversight, we can allow the administration to finalize its guidance and eventually move forward on a formal rulemaking process. Or Congress could define navigable water ourselves. But why would this Congress do its job when it can complain about the administration not doing its job? Madam Chairwoman, 2 years ago, the Corps and EPA issued a draft guidance to provide additional clarity on this issue. They took public comment on the draft for 90 days and received over 230,000 comments on the guidance, comments that were overwhelmingly favorable. The draft guidance provides a more predictable and consistent procedure for identifying waters and wetlands protected under the Clean Water Act. It focuses on protecting smaller waterways that keep downstream waters safe from upstream pollutants, and on protecting adjacent wetlands that filter pollution and store water and help keep communities safe from floods. The guidance also maintains all of the existing exemptions for agricultural discharges and waters and identifies specific types of water bodies to which it does not apply. Areas like artificial lakes and ponds and many types of drainage and irrigation ditches. It does not extend federal protection to any waters not historically protected under the Clean Water Act, and it's fully consistent with the law and the decisions and instructions of the Supreme Court. So I think we should let the administration go forward, provide greater clarity, and we can only do that by striking Section 107. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
I claim time to rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in strong opposition to the gentleman's amendment to strike Section 107 of the Energy and Water Development Appropriations Bill. Section 107 prohibits the Corps of Engineers from developing, adopting, and implementing, administrating, or enforcing any change to the Corps and EPA rules and guidance defining the waters of the United States. This provision is aimed at the so-called guidance which the Environmental Protection Agency and the Corps of Engineers have developed to expand the extent of waters covered by the Clean Water Act. The so-called guidance goes far beyond merely clarifying the scope of waters subject to the Clean Water Act programs. This guidance has been sitting around for nearly 3 years and is acting as de facto law. By the agency's own admission, the guidance will substantially change federal policy with respect to which waters fall under the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act and significantly increase the scope of the federal government's power to regulate waters and land associated with those waters. The effect of the guidance will be to reverse the decisions by the United States Supreme Court that recognize limits to the federal government's regulatory authority and to undermine the long-standing federal-state partnerships in the regulation of waters. This expansion has resulted in confusion, permitting delays, and added costs and burdens for communities, farmers, small businessmen, industries, and other Americans. The administration has issued this so-called guidance and has refused to go to the rulemaking process, which violates the principles of the Administrative Procedures Act, the APA, and the intent of Congress when they enacted the law. The APA sets the standards for the activities and rulemaking for all federal regulatory agencies and is designed to ensure those federal agencies use open, uniform, and fair procedures. This requirement of the APA are not mere formalities. In unilaterally developing its guidance, the administration has ignored calls from the state agencies and environmental groups, as well as members of Congress, including almost half the members of the House of Representatives, to proceed through the normal rulemaking procedures and has avoided consulting with the states, which are the federal agency partners in implementing the Clean Water Act. This amendment condones the administration's willingness to ignore the requirements of the APA and supports the administration's federal jurisdictional power grab in the Clean Water Act. I urge members to oppose this amendment. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition? The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes. Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
If you like confusion, keep the status quo and oppose the amendment. If you want to get clarity and you want to understand and you want to get investment and progress, and if you want to have people understand what the law is, support the amendment. The proposal that has been put forward by the Corps of Engineers is clarity itself. It does not change the decision wrongly made by the Supreme Court, no matter how much I might dislike that decision. What it does is it allows people to know what the law is as set forth by the Supreme Court. Foreclosing the Corps of Engineers from carrying out its proper responsibilities under the law going back before 1899 is an act of extraordinary unwisdom and stupidity. My colleagues on the other side do not understand the issue. The simple fact of the matter is, all this does is to allow the Corps of Engineers to tell the people of the United States what the law is with regard to what is navigable waters that may be affected by pollution, ditching, draining, and doing other things. So when you vote to strike the section, you are not changing the law. You are allowing the Corps of Engineers to set forth what the rules happen to be. And you are allowing the Supreme Court to bring clarity to the decision-making of the United States, and seeing to it that people may then go forward and invest and do the other things that are necessary in the light of the decision of the Supreme Court, which again, I repeat, is not changed. Not by the amendment which is offered by my friends from Virginia. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment offered by Mr. Moran of Virginia, because it brings clarity to a confused situation and it makes plain and apparent what the law is. And if you want to get progress so that people will know how they're going to invest in doing things that affect their property in the waters of the United States, supporting the amendment is the way to do it. And failing to support the amendment is to assure that confusion will continue to exist and that businesses, industry, and the communities of the United States that need to act upon the waters to see to it that they are protected and that they are preserved. You're seeing to it by opposing the amendment that that cannot be done. The Supreme Court was wrong in the decision which they made. I was here on the floor when we agreed that the navigable waters are all of the waters of the United States. The Supreme Court was either too ignorant or too lazy to bother reading that particular debate. But the legislative history of the law is clear. But I repeat, this does not move us forward back to the old way, and it does not change the unfortunate decision of the Supreme Court. What it does is it assures that for the first time since this kind of amendment was offered on the floor, that we are able to finally begin to move forward to deal with the law as it affects navigability, the Clean Water Act, and the other things which are so important, both to protecting our waters and to assuring that business and industry may invest with a clear understanding of what the law is. To oppose this amendment is to assure that there will be more litigation, which will cause more obfuscation and delay, and more difficulty in terms of achieving our purpose of having American citizens be able to enjoy the water in accordance with the law as the Corps of Engineers will set it out so that everyone will know what the law is, rather than the Congress stultifying the law and seeing to it that we're incapable of having a clear pronouncement of what the law is as made by the agency which has responsibility to do so under the law. I urge you to support the amendment. I urge you to strike Section 107, and I urge you to get this country going forward on a very important matter, which is being thoroughly obfuscated by a lot of people who know nothing about the matter. I urge the adoption of the amendment and the striking of the section.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Idaho seek recognition?
Madam Chairman, I move to strike last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairman, Mr. Moran and I have had this discussion about 6 or 7 times on this very amendment over the past few years. And once again, I rise to oppose it. And contrary to what the gentleman from Michigan just said, I do understand the issue, and frankly, understanding it is why I'm opposed to it. In 2006, the Supreme Court determined that the EPA and the Corps of Engineers did not have the authority to regulate non-navigable waters under the Clean Water Act. Now, you might disagree with that Supreme Court decision. Tough luck. They made the decision. And we follow the decisions of the Supreme Court. In accordance with this decision, the term navigable waters has long been the phrase used to limit federal intrusion with regards to the Clean Water Act's authority. Non-navigable waters are currently regulated by the states. Everybody that stands up and talks assumes that if it is a non-navigable water, that nobody is regulating it. In fact, the states are regulating those things. However, last year the Corps of Engineers and the EPA issued guidance that would expand the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act to non-navigable intrastate waters, effectively resulting in a massive expansion of the federal government's authority to increase the number of waters subject to the water quality standards, including irrigation canals, drainage ditches, and other things. Deciding how water is used should be the responsibility of the state and local officials who are familiar with the people and local issues. If all intra-state waters are regulated by the federal government, the language could be broadly interpreted to include everything within a state, including groundwater. As a result, the reach of the federal jurisdiction would be so broad that it could significantly restrict landowners' ability to make decisions about their own property and local governments' ability to plan for their own development. The language in the bill protects the authority of the states to prevent the Army Corps from expanding its regulations to include intrastate bodies of water under the Clean Water Act for any reason other than drinking water standards. Clarity is needed to this issue, and the gentleman from Michigan mentioned clarity. But I will tell you, clarity, simply for clarity's sake, is not an answer. Death is a clarity. It's not necessarily the outcome you want, though. So doing this just so that you have clarity in it is not the right direction to go. Congress does need to provide that clarity, but not the agencies through the regulatory process. The Supreme Court has already determined that the Army Corps does not have the authority to do what it is proposing, and I would urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment offered by my good friend from Virginia, Mr. Moran.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Strike the last word in opposition to the amendment.
And the gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chairman, I am rising, I hope, to provide some clarity to this by quoting directly from the guidance that the agency's given us. Now, it's important to remember that this is a guidance, not a rule. The Obama administration, President Obama, has repeatedly and proudly said that if Congress won't act, he will. Last week he said he's going to stand up and through executive order do all that he can to try to bring carbon emissions under the jurisdiction of the federal government and try to restrict CO2 by executive order. Here, the Obama administration is doing what the law says they can't do, and that is expand the jurisdiction of the EPA and the Army Corps by guidance, not by using a rule. The law says they have to issue a rule, get public input, have hearings. Here, they simply got a bunch of their lawyers together and issued guidance to their agencies around the country. And to quote directly from the guidance, the Obama administration directs, quote, the agencies to interpret waters in the region to be the watershed boundary defined by the geographic area that drains to the nearest downstream traditional navigable water or interstate water through a single point of entry, close quote. The geographic boundary, every stream, every rivulet, no matter how vertical it is, the Supreme Court and the statute said that we're limited to, the EPA is limited to regulating navigable waters. The way this reads, you literally, the EPA and the Army Corps now, through this guidance, have the authority to regulate every single stream of water that drains in the geographic area, in the watershed boundary that drains to the nearest traditional navigable water. That is an incredible expansion of federal power. As a gentleman from Idaho quite correctly said, this was done outside of the normal rulemaking process because the Obama administration knew that the public would overwhelmingly disapprove of this, that the Congress would disapprove of this, that this goes beyond what the Supreme Court intended, that this goes beyond what the law allows, so they did it through the back door using lawyers and bureaucrats to write a 33-page document that you literally have to go to the back end of to learn that they are attempting to exercise jurisdiction over every stream of water that in a geographic area that drains to the nearest navigable waterway. That's why Chairman Frelinghuysen, Chairman Rogers included this language to cut off funding for the implementation of this rule, because we've discovered the Obama administration will do whatever they want regardless of the Constitution. They ignore subpoenas, they ignore congressional hearings, they ignore letters from Congress, they ignore everything except when you cut off the money. That's the only way to make the Obama administration follow the law. Vote against this amendment to ensure that the Obama administration follows the law and that we protect private property rights and keep the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers off of people's private property across America. And I urge members to oppose the gentleman's amendment.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Ohio seek recognition?
Yes, I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes, Madam Chair, I support the gentleman's amendment. I've just been listening to the debate and thinking, you know, we're a great nation because we figured out how to build a nation. We had 13 colonies, and then miraculously, somehow, through the Northwest Ordinance and other means, we added more states and we figured out where their boundaries were. Sadly, Michigan and Ohio had to fight a little war on a piece of territory between us, but we even got that figured out. And then, golly, you know, we sort of expanded. Even Alaska became a state, and as we became more adult as a nation, we figured out where the watersheds were. We even have maps for watersheds in our country. We've always been a country that is a can-do nation, not a can't-do nation. And so I believe the amendment takes America in an important direction by allowing the Corps the needed flexibility to deal with real confusion that has reigned in the wake of 2 Supreme Court decisions and, frankly, climate change. As water distribution changes around our country, we are moving into a different era if anybody cares to open their eyes and look at what is happening across our country. Without this amendment, the bill would result in increased implementation costs to federal and state resource agencies as well as to the regulated community, increased delays in the implementation of important public works projects, and protracted litigation on the disparity between existing federal regulations and the two court decisions. Further, the current provision does not apply to just this year. It applies to any subsequent Energy and Water Development Act, ensuring the uncertainty continues indefinitely. How is that good for anything? Why is can't do better than can do? Let's provide clarity. Let's provide some certainty to the market. We should be allowing the Corps to take actions that address the Supreme Court's rulings, bringing clarity and certainty to the regulatory process, not prolonging the confusion, further delay, further uncertainty. How does that help anything, regardless of what region of the country you live in? I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. And I take back my yield my remaining time.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I move to strike the last word.
And the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. This amendment here actually puts a lot of my district in jeopardy. My district relies heavily on irrigation and canals and other type of water projects. And when you see a government agency, an unelected government agency, come in and take jurisdiction without any of us in this body, 435 members in this body who have a responsibility to represent our constituents and make sure their voices are heard, and you take that power away and you give it to a bureaucracy in the dark of night where there's not an opportunity to actually speak their minds and have their voices heard, you set up for a pretty bad precedent. And when you look at a constituency that feeds the country, I mean, we are in California, and on my part of the valley, we do feed a good portion of the country. We grow 350 different crops. We produce a lot of beef, poultry, pork, and all these different products go to feed the nation. And when you look at an idea like this where a lot of my constituents, or most of my constituents, all oppose, we're setting up for a really bad idea. So this should be presented, it should be talked about amongst the 435, not one agency, not one president pushing an idea. So obviously I rise in opposition to this, and I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman from Georgia recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I rise to oppose the amendment offered by my friend from Virginia, and I do so for 3 reasons. And I believe that the previous speakers on our side have listed these reasons, but I want to just drive this point. There's 3 of them. Number 1, it does cede a tremendous amount of power to the executive branch. And it's clear that this administration prefers to bypass Congress every chance it gets and cede things to an unelected bureaucracy. And in this case, this is a tremendous decision that the bureaucracy would be making instead of the elected representatives in the House and the Senate. Mr. Culverson actually quoted part of it, and he said that the agencies will interpret in the region such proximate other waters to be the watershed boundary defined by the geographic area that drains to the nearest downstream navigational or interstate water through a single point of entry. So in my district, where we have the Savannah River and the St. Mary's River, the Ogeechee River, the Altamaha River, and the Hoopie, it would appear that the entire district, which I represent in coastal Georgia, would come under this new permitting process if the bureaucrats and if Mr. Moran had his way. I'm against that. If that's going to happen, let the legislative branch debate it and then send it to the executive branch. Number 2, if you do so, all you're going to do is have more busybody bureaucrats in our lives interfering with job creation, interfering with progress in general. You know, my area, the Savannah River, was authorized in the 1999 WRDA Act to dredge the river. 13 years, Madam Chair. It took 13 years for 4 federal agencies to sign off on the dredging, even though we have been dredging the Savannah River ever since Oglethorpe sailed up it in 1733. But it took our government 4 federal agencies 13 years to give us a record of decision. During that period of time, China started to build a port that is now bigger than the port of Savannah. They started from scratch to finish, and here we are supposed to be competing in a world marketplace, but that's the kind of permitting process and delays that the bureaucracies cause us. I'd rather leave these waters under state jurisdiction than the federal government. And number three, and finally, it's vague. It's totally vague. Anytime the federal bureaucrats with their unlimited bank accounts get involved in rulemaking, they can run the clock, they can charge up the permitting, the lawyer fees, do everything they want. I'll ask a question, my friend from Virginia. Can you tell me what significant nexus to navigable waters means? Does anybody know what that means? I can promise you 435 people in this body would have a different definition as to what a significant nexus to navigable waters means. We do not need this executive branch and this administration to have more power. This is the crowd that brought you the IRS, the AP scandal. This is the crowd that brought you Fast and Furious. Do you really want them to have more power to interpret laws? I think not. I fear they would use that kind of authority to reward their friends and punish their enemies. And for these three reasons, Madam Chair, I oppose the amendment. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Any other member on this amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia, and those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Madam Chairwoman,
the gentleman from Virginia.
I would ask for a recorded vote on that.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia will be postponed. Clerk will read.
Page 11, line 20, Section 108, Section 3A6 of the Water Resources Development Act of 1988 is amended. Section 109, Section 1001, 17A of the Water Resources Development Act of 2007 is amended. Section 110, the authorization under the heading Little Calumet River Basin of the Water Resources Development Act of 1986 is further modified. Section 111, the limitation relating to total project costs in Section 902 of the Water Resources Development Act of 1986 shall not apply. Section 112, none of the funds may be used by the Corps of Engineers to develop.
And for what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Madam Chairwoman, I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in the Congressional Record, offered by Mr. Moran of Virginia.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. My colleague John Dingell and I have another amendment that strikes, in this case, Section 112 of this bill, because Section 112 would prevent the Corps of Engineers from updating regulations defining the terms fill material or discharge of fill material for the purposes of the Clean Water Act. Presently, the Army Corps issues a Section 404 permit if the fill material discharged into a water body raises the bottom elevation of that water body or converts an area to dry land. When Congress first enacted the Clean Water Act, and that's why Mr. Dingell is so concerned about this, the 404 permit process was supposed to be used for certain construction projects, like bridges and roads, where raising the bottom elevation of a water body or converting an area into dry land was simply unavoidable. But then some clever attorneys in the George W. Bush administration found a way to allow mining waste to be dumped into rivers and streams without a rigorous environmental review process. They simply changed the definition of what qualifies as fill material. Under a 2002 rule change, the Bush administration broadened that definition to, and I put this in quotes, include rock, sand, soil, clay, plastics, construction debris, wood chips, overburden from mining or other excavation activities. Now, these guidelines are simply not well suited for evaluating the environmental effects of discharging hazardous waste such as mining refuse and similar materials into a water body or wetland. When Congress first enacted the Clean Water Act, and for the first 30 years of its passage, the law helped keep America's lakes, rivers, and streams safe from mining pollution, protected wildlife and drinking water. But that's no longer the case today. Perhaps it would come as no surprise to many that in 2009, the Supreme Court upheld this newer, broader definition of fill material that was adopted by the executive branch in 2002. The Court allowed this new definition to be used for a Kensington mining operation near Lower Slate Lake in Alaska. I want to point out this anecdotal example, although it's a very important one. So the permit allowed the discharge of toxic wastewater from a gold ore processing mill to go untreated directly into the lake, despite the fact that the discharge violates EPA standards for the mining industry. Today, all of Lower Slate Lake's fish and aquatic life are gone, dead. Now, Madam Chairwoman, that's why we raised this amendment to strike Section 112, which would permanently preclude the Corps from considering any regulatory changes to the current definition and permit process. I would note that to much of the environmental community's frustration, the Corps hasn't issued any regulations to change the definition of fill material or discharge of fill material. You can go back to that language that came about as a result of that clever change in 2002. You can find no effort by the Corps to change it. And the Corps hasn't expressed any plans to do so. That's disappointing. But since there is no time limit on the provision in this appropriations bill, it would not only block the current administration, but any future administration from considering any changes, even one less sympathetic to the adverse health and environmental consequences of discharging hazardous waste into our drinking water. Madam Chairwoman, this provision that's in this bill is intended to be a preemptive strike against protecting our drinking water. We should not be putting this kind of legislation onto an appropriations bill, particularly when it has such adverse consequences to the future health of our population. And that's why I would urge my colleagues to join me in removing this section from this appropriations bill. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I stand in opposition to the amendment offered by my friend from Virginia, and I want to start out by clarifying something that was said a minute ago, that this was done by clever Bush administration lawyers. In fact, it was a rule proposed by President Clinton. That would be Democrat President Clinton. A rule proposed by Democrat President Clinton. Now, there was a public comment period. It wasn't done in the dark of the night, but it was done with public comments. And the rule was changed in 2002, which is true that President Bush would have been the president during that time period, but it was an ongoing and a slow and deliberate process, and it was simply a common sense need that was something that I think was pro-business, which I understand is offensive to some people, but it also streamlines the bureaucracy and helps private sector create jobs. And all it simply did was get the Corps of Engineers and the EPA to have the same definition of fill. That's not a radical concept. That's common sense. And again, if we're going to compete in the world marketplace, we should have common sense even with Washington bureaucrats. Now, the definition includes materials that, when placed into the waters of the U.S., have the effect of replacing or changing the bottom elevation of any portion of that water. Therefore, it includes rock, sand, soil, clay, plastics, construction debris, wood chips, and overburden from mining. These are regulated right now. They're not exempt from this. It simply says that the EPA and the Corps of Engineers would use the same definition. So I stand in opposition to this, and I do not think that this is the purpose of the gentleman's amendment, but I do worry that as this administration seems to have an open war going on coal, is this perhaps part of it? Not necessarily this amendment, but the thinking that two different agencies can now get on a different sheet in terms of what a definition is, and therefore one agency could be more proactive in slowing up progress in activities in which you don't approve. There is an estimation that if this was to happen, 375,000 jobs in the mining business could be jeopardized. Now understand, this administration doesn't like mining, but for the rest of us who use the products in the United States of America, this is something that is significant and disturbing. 375,000 jobs in what we have called an anemic recovery already. So I believe that the responsible thing for us to do is to reject this amendment and say that if this definition does need to be changed, let it not be done by bureaucrats. And let it not be done by lawyers either, but let it be done by the elected representatives, both Democrat and Republican, of the American people. And let 218 of us in the House have a yes or a no vote, and then 51 in the Senate, and then send it to the White House for signature, rather than have unelected bureaucrats who no one knows make these very important, significant legal decisions for us. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition? And the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes. The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support the amendment offered by my good friend from Virginia. I urge them to strike Section 112. There is no one in this chamber that owns this world. We borrow it from those who come behind us in the future. And we owe them a duty to see to it that we return it in proper form. The bill as drafted forbids the federal government from seeing to it that all manner of defilement is dumped into the navigable waters of the United States. This is having an appalling consequence, destroying waters, killing fish, polluting the water sources of our communities and cities. But beyond that, it's doing something else. A race of unscrupulous people are sawing the tops off our mountains in the Appalachians and other places. And they're taking that spoil and dropping it in river valleys and filling them up. The result of which is that the water flowing through that valley becomes highly acidic. And it produces severe danger not just to fish and wildlife, but to human beings. These are the waters of the United States that are being defiled. The amendment would at least afford a moderate level of authority to the federal government, which has always been that authority of the federal government, to protect one of the greatest treasures this nation has, its flowing waters. My colleagues on the other side think that that is a question of jobs. We're going to mine, and we should, but we should do it carefully and wisely and well, with due attention to the future and to our trusteeship of the world that we love. We do not have the right to defile our waters. We have a duty to protect this land and to see to it that it is returned to future generations of Americans in as good a shape as we have found it, and perhaps, if we can, in a better shape. What they have done is to change the situation where now almost anything goes. And the result is a calamity for the future of the United States. Water is one of the next coming great shortages of this nation. It's something that is going to be very much missed by our future generations, because we have, by adopting this bill without this amendment, defiled those waters, made them unsafe to drink and to recreate in, made them unsafe for all kinds of purposes, including even industrial use of those waters. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment offered by my good friend from Virginia. I urge you, my dear friends and colleagues, to look to the future of the country, whose custodians and trustees we are, to see to it that we return this beautiful nation of ours to the future generations in the condition in which we found it and which is suitable and fitting to the greatest nation in the world. We can have mining, we can have all of the other things we need, but all we have to do under the law as it has been is to do it wisely, carefully, prudently, and well, with due regard for the future. This language in the bill, stricken by the amendment offered by my colleague from Virginia, would defile those waters and defile the future of this nation. I beg you support the amendment. I beg you strike the section. I beg you be good trustees of the future and of the great gifts that God has given this nation, and to strike Section 112 so that we can properly protect one of the great blessings that this nation has, an abundance of water, which the language of the bill as now drawn will defile and destroy. And people in the Appalachians will curse us for what we have done to them by filling stream valleys with muck and corruption, by defiling the waters and the rivers and the streams and the lakes of the United States. This is not good custodianship. This is disregard of the greatest opportunity that we have, and that is to return to our future generations this nation in the shape in which they will want it to be and we want it to be.
Gentleman's time has expired. What purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek
Move to strike the
recognition?
last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I rise in strong opposition to the gentleman's amendment to strike Section 112 of the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill. The current regulatory definition of the term fill material is consistent with EPA and Corps' long-standing practice and ensures that necessary placement of excess rock and soil generated by construction and development projects in waters of the United States are regulated by the Corps under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. This current rule brings certainty and protects the environment. Now, both the EPA and the Corps have stated they are considering revising the definition of fill material. For unelected bureaucrats to redefine this important definition would have a significant impact on the ability of all earth-moving industries, road and highway construction projects, and private and commercial enterprises to obtain vital Clean Water Act Section 404 permits. Changing the definition of fill material could result in the loss of up to 375,000 high-paying mining jobs, and further this administration's assault on over 1 million jobs that are dependent upon the economic output generated by these operations. Congress should therefore reject any attempts to add a new, inappropriately narrow definition of term fill material that would not only harm existing operations, but would also halt many new job-creating projects. I urge all the members to oppose this amendment. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. Who seeks recognition? What purpose does the gentlelady from Ohio seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
I would like to rise in support of Congressman Moran's amendment to strike Section 112 and to protect the fresh waters of our nation for future generations. I note that many of those who have spoken in opposition to the Moran amendment do not live in parts of the country that actually would be affected by the burial of this material. Section 112 would prohibit the Corps from amending its regulations to change the definition of fill material and discharge of fill material so that discharges of mine wastes and similar materials into the waters of the United States would be regulated under the more environmentally protective regulations and standards issued under the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System Permit Program in Section 402 of the Clean Water Act and administered by the states along with EPA. I don't know how many members actually have had to deal with cleaning up messes in their districts, but I'll tell you, I didn't know once I became a member of Congress how significant the work would be that I would have to do just in my region of the country to clean up the mess from the past. Well, I've learned too much. And maybe the districts of those who are standing up in opposition to Mr. Moran's amendment have never had to do this. But let me tell you, there are dead lakes, freshwater lakes, very close, in fact, in Ohio to the gentleman who just spoke in opposition to Mr. Moran's amendment. Lakes that have been polluted, and no one knows how to clean them up. I actually have had the task of representing a river that is dead, with waste that's in the bottom of the river that washes out into adjoining streams in the lake, and all the scientists are trying to figure out how to cap it, how to do this, how to do that with the PCBs and everything else. There are love canals all across this country. We have to change the way we live for the future generations of this country. How about trying to clean up beryllium that's moving along in streams and washing out, and you see rising cancer rates? And why are cancer rates in certain parts of the country more than in other parts of the country? Well, the legacy of the past, the messes that aren't cleaned up. How about unexploded ordnance on the bottoms of streams and rivers and lakes across this country? If you get the Department of Defense charts on what happens, what exists in this country that needs to be cleaned up, it is staggering. The defense cleanup costs that are necessary just across this nation, including in some of our freshwater lakes. If you don't know about the problems, well, I'm sorry that you don't. But I don't see how adding mine waste to the rest of this mess is going to make the future better than the past. If you think about the population of the country, we had 146 million people in the country 50, 60 years ago. Today we have 310 million. By 2050 it's going to be 500 million. But you know what's not going to increase? The amount of water we have. The amount of fresh water is not an infinite resource. It is absolutely finite. And it's used once, and maybe it drops down again in the rain, but nobody's going to give us more water. It's either going to be snowfall, it's going to be rain, it's going to wash into our streams and rivers, but there's not going to be any more. We're going to have so many more people, 5, 6, 7 times more people than we had in the past. Why would we risk burying more junk in our rivers, in our streams, throwing it out in these riverbeds around the country? If you haven't faced the task of trying to clean it up, then you shouldn't even be voting on this bill. It is the cost of past cleanup is enormous. I wish I didn't have to deal with it in my region of the country. Hey, I came here to make the parks better. I came here to build better housing. I came here to create jobs. And I'm finding I have these billion-dollar cleanup jobs for which we have no money. No money to clean them up. Why would we add to the problem? Under the current definition, such discharges are evaluated under the Clean Water Act, Section 404b1 guidelines, which are not well suited for evaluating the environmental effects of discharging hazardous waste like mining refuse and similar materials into jurisdictional wetlands and waters. And further, the current provision does not apply to just this year. It applies to any subsequent Energy and Water Development Act, precluding potential changes that may be necessary to protect public health or the environment. If you haven't seen babies that have tumors in their brains because some company buried waste in parks that those children played in, then somebody better wake up around here and change the way that we do business in this country, because we cannot do this. We cannot continue the bad practices of the past. We have to make life better for future generations that will have more pressures on them simply because of population growth in this country. I urge my colleagues to support the Moran amendment and commend them for offering it on this bill today.
The young lady's time has expired. Who seeks recognition? Questions on the amendment? What purpose does the gentlelady from West Virginia seek recognition?
I'd like to move to strike the last word, please.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise today in opposition to the Moran amendment. Basically, at a May Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee hearing on water, I specifically asked the EPA's acting administrator for water, Nancy Stoner, what specific problems with the current definition of fill material was prompting the agency and the Corps to examine their current definition. Administrator Stoner at that time did not identify any problem. This was just recently in May with the current definition, and instead told me there were no active discussions with the Corps on revising the 2002 definition of fill material. I do live in an area that this is greatly affects. We got a lot of water in West Virginia, by God's good grace. Given that the EPA official charged with overseeing water problems did not identify any problems with the current definition of fill material in response to a specific question from me, it is difficult for me to see why the EPA and the Corps would attempt to change an established definition. The current definition of fill material has been in place for over a decade and provides a fair standard for protecting our water while allowing for economic activity. The 2002 definition was the result of a very lengthy rulemaking process that began under President Clinton's administration and was finalized under the Bush administration. A balance between our economy and the environment is absolutely essential. A balance between protecting our environment and creating jobs is essential, and the current definition does just that. The federal government must provide regulatory certainty to job creators, and changing definitions without adequate justification. If the administrator had responded differently to the question that I posed to her, I might not be standing here today with this type of opposition. But in my view, I think that we need to oppose this amendment, keep the current definition of fill material that's been well-researched, well-used, and is in effect in the state of West Virginia, that is used quite a bit for to continue our mining operations, continue to keep good, solid West Virginians working. And I yield back.
Back her time. Questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair. The noes have it.
Mr. Chairman.
From Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask for a roll call vote on that.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia will be postponed. Clerk will read.
Section 1, page 13, line 10, Section 113. The Secretary shall not promulgate any regulation that prohibits an individual from possessing a firearm at a water resources development project. Title II, Department of the Interior, Central Utah Project.
Clerk will suspend. What purpose does the gentleman from Connecticut rise?
Speaker, strike the last word, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to commend the gentlelady from Ohio and the gentleman from New Jersey and for the debate in general that we've witnessed on this floor. I think we can all agree in so many respects that infrastructure is not a Republican or a Democratic issue. It's an American issue. I come here this afternoon to reason. Funny word here, I guess, in Congress, but in fact, it's something I think we need to do more of. I come here disheartened to see this bill come to the floor that is underinvesting in something that is critical to the nation, flood protection. Amongst the many infrastructure issues, it's one that imperils many districts, including my own. We have systems that for 75 years have not been addressed in a way that they need to be. All around us, whether it's in my district or anywhere across this country, infrastructure problems abound, whether it's roads, whether it's bridges, whether it's airports, whether it's deep harbors, whether it's school systems, or whether it's levees. They are in need of repair. They are in need of our investment as a nation. The great irony is that in these difficult economic times, what we need is to put the country back to work. What is required for the country to go back to work is to improve the very infrastructure over which our commerce grows and flows, that provides our economy with the kind of boost that it needs, that puts our people back to work. I've heard person after person get up and cite China on the other side, talking about their vast development. How has China moved forward, if not in developing its own infrastructure? Yet here in our country, the neglect continues. Congress cannot continue to sleep while our infrastructure erodes from underneath us. The levees between Hartford and East Hartford have been cited in study after study that needs the attention that local municipalities have put in their own funding for, but cannot possibly match what the federal government is required, not just in my state and in my district, but all across this country. Case in point can be made with Hurricane Sandy, where the government spent $60 billion in disaster relief. By funding projects that is the prudent thing to do, we know that for every dollar spent that we do in preserving and making safe our districts by improving the infrastructure is $4 that's saved in this country. It's hard for people back in my district, and especially people who gather at Augie and Ray's, a local stand in my district where they serve hot dogs and hamburgers and coffee and breakfast in the morning. They can't understand why it is that Congress can't get together and reason and understand that by funding the infrastructure, not by cutting back on the Army Corps, not by continuing to cut programs that will provide funding for jobs, but actually by investing in Americans instead of sitting idly by and watching as other nations, especially our chief competitors, invest in their own infrastructure, improve their own security, while Congress sleeps and watches the slow erosion of what was the once greatest system in the world and still can be if we come together and reason and invest in our systems, invest in our people, invest in our security, invest in a protection that will make sure that the American people are safe, secure, and most importantly, back to work. It's neither Democrat or Republican. It's fundamentally American. Thank you, Madam.
Gentleman's time has expired. What purpose does the gentlelady from Washington seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to strike the last word.